Hello and welcome to Rough Cut, your community-driven podcast on navigating the art and practice of video journalism and nonfiction filmmaking from the Video Consortium. I'm Daniel Chávez, this episode's guest host. I'm a Mexican documentary editor based in the California Bay Area whose work focuses on topics such as immigration and social justice. Today, I'm talking with Stephanie Jenkins, archival researcher, documentary producer, and co-director of the Archival Producers Alliance. So let's jump into it. It's really nice to see you, Stephanie. How are you?
I'm so good. It's great to see you. And something that's been really fun about the last year is getting to meet folks like you. And then here we are on a podcast.
Yeah, so to let everyone know, Stephanie and I met last year at Big Sky Documentary Film Festival in Montana. She actually gave a talk about AI, and for me it was like super interesting, and I definitely want to share all of this with the community of BC. So we prepared like this podcast kind of for a year, and today we're recording it, and we're going to dive into this conversation about how AI is affecting or molding, the documentary world.
Yeah, super excited to be here. And when we met, that was the first time I had ever given a public talk on this subject. So I'm much more equipped to talk about it now than I was in February 24, because it's been a whirlwind of a year of thinking through and talking about generative AI in documentaries, especially as it applies to primary sources and archival production.
I don't know if a lot of people know what's the role of an archival producer in a documentary film. Could you start by explaining that?
So archival producers, they research, they source, and they manage any archival material, including footage, photos, audio, text, ephemera for use in documentary films, in podcasts, and also museums. Anything that involves, the boring way to put it perhaps, is third-party material that you're bringing into your film. That can be the realm of an archival producer. So it can involve research online, as well as on site at various archives when things aren't digitized. And that can be including commercial, academic, personal collections. A lot of different things can be archives. From, your grandmother's closet can be an archive, or, ABC News video source can be an archive. It's a whole range depending on what's needed for a project. And because of that, archival producers are pretty scrappy, and they take with them from job to job a whole set of contacts. So an archival producer can both know how to find Icelandic news from the 1980s and know how to clear a TikTok. Like it's a whole realm of negotiations and arcane knowledge that, if working in concert with producers and directors and editors, can really make a whole documentary sing and can bring a level of authenticity to it that I think is really interesting and really essential in a lot of the work that I love.
I remember that during your talk last year at Big Sky, you mentioned like an anecdote about the film that you were working on about Muhammad Ali, and directed by Ken Burns, and you said that you went to like a basement, right, to find that reel of film. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think it's very cinematic how you actually like narrated that time.
Oh, thank you. Well, yeah. So I've been fortunate enough to be a producer and archival producer with Ken Burns for the last 15 years, and I produced an 8-hour-long documentary about Muhammad Ali. And at Florentine Films, which is the name of the production company, archival work and production work are really integrated, which is something I love about working there. So, in addition to doing all the archive, I also set up interviews, cast the film, do a lot of research, help in edits, that kind of thing. So I've really learned through that way of working how, when you really integrate archival research into the storytelling, that can make archive really sing. So we knew going into telling the story of Muhammad Ali that setting up his life as a young person was going to be very important to understanding his origins. And when you understand a figure like that, this towering cultural figure, when you understand their origins, it's a lot easier to relate to them as a viewer. Mm-hmm. So after he became heavyweight champion, he could not find a camera he didn't love. But before that, cameras don't necessarily follow someone who isn't famous yet. So I was able to, after making many, many calls over the course of 2 years, I worked closely with folks at the WHAS station, which is an ABC-owned station in Louisville, Kentucky, and they allowed me pretty unprecedented access into their archive, which turned out to be in the sub-basement in their Louisville station office. And it was just stacks and stacks and rolls and rolls and rolls of film that really hadn't been touched. And luckily, they also have, this is not normal, they had someone, when they were shooting the original newscasts back, starting in the 1940s, they would have a camera person or someone at the station write down what they shot that day and what would have ended up in a local cut news story. And at a lot of local news archives, that information has been lost. So you don't actually know what you're going to find on any given reel of film. So I went through about 30 years of handwritten and typed logs of everything that was shot. And I did come across this one story that said amateur boxing. And from I think it was 1955 or 1956. I was like, oh, okay, that could be interesting. I don't know. It involves boxing. And I had that reel digitized. And when I got back to my office, there he was. There was a 13-year-old, 12-year-old Cassius Clay signing up for a boxing tournament. And he had that sort of charisma that bounces off of a screen. But if I hadn't gone and spent 3 weeks in an archive, this is not something that they knew they had. And it's not something that was anywhere near the internet. And so I think what I found was, aside from perhaps some home movies shot by the family, some of the earliest moving image material of a young Cassius Clay.
Essentially, what's the role of a archival producer? For me, it's like a person who finds treasures and gold, for the film, and just to share it, with the production team, but also with the world, basically, so we can like really find that. And it's just amazing. Actually, right now I'm working on a film about Luis Valdez, who was one of the captains of the
You're working
California,
on that with Jen Petruccelli?
With Jennifer Petruccelli, yeah, I know. Yeah, so who's one of the founders of the APA, which is Archival Producers Alliance, that you're also founder of.
Absolutely. I love that you're working with her. She's completely brilliant. This is awesome.
To move forward, actually, could you tell us about the Archival Producers Alliance? I know that you're one of the founders.
Yeah. So if it's not clear already, I love archival producing and I love the world of archives, primary sources, all of that. And I knew that there's a rich community to be had there. So the whole thing really got started when Jennifer Petruccelli, Rachel Antel, and we met, and they were archival producing a documentary about a longitudinal piece about American history. And they were watching The Cut one day and saw this amazing sketch or photograph of someone that they had been looking for an image of for over a year and hadn't found. And so they went to the director and said, how did you find this representation of this character? This is amazing. And he said he generated it. And so this raised a lot of questions about, what does it mean to generate something when you haven't found it in the archive? And it also happened that this was a representation of a female subject, and she looked suspiciously like Angelina Jolie with like a 20-inch waist. Like she was like gorgeous. And so it automatically also brought up these questions around bias and why are computers making these decisions about how a historical figure would look. And then from there, we went on and talked to other archival producers. And this was 2 years ago, just when ChatGPT was coming online. And we, as archival producers, were often below the line. We might be brought on kind of late on a project or kind of be intermittent. And so we don't necessarily have the power to say, hey, I have ethical concerns about how you're doing this. We don't necessarily have the power, and it's not necessarily right for us to do that on a lot of the productions we're working on. So we wrote a set of guidelines around the use of generative AI in documentary film, partially to have a document for our colleagues to use. If something came up on a production that didn't feel quite right, they would have something as recourse or like have language. So when we started co-writing them, it ended up being a wonderful process. We got 15 archival producers together. We met every week for 8 to 10 weeks and co-wrote them. And it was like a documentary masterclass. It was like it's like going to grad school when I've never been to grad school. This all came together because of an invitation from the International Documentary Association, who said, if you draft something, you can present it. So what we want to look at it is how could generative AI be used in documentaries, especially as it applies to archival resources, and what do we want to preserve, and how about our practice as it is, and how can generative AI help that? How can it hurt it? And really looking at the tools and saying, we don't want our practice to be dictated by what's available from the tools that we're given. We want our practice to dictate how we use them. So the guidelines are really an invitation for people to think through what can generative AI tools offer us? What are they good at? And what do we need to be more wary of, especially in their early forms now? So the document breaks down into 4 basic principles. The first is the value of primary sources. So primary sources, they can't be replaced. Even though archives are very biased, they're often exhibit the people in power were the ones that could save and preserve their stories, and actively destroyed or suppressed stories and memories of those that they didn't want available. So nothing can replace primary sources. And if you do want to use generative AI to replace them, whether it be through reenactment or many other things, you just need to consider that a lot of outputs are really biased and they're very inaccurate. So if you spend a lot of time telling an accurate documentary, why would you want to include visuals that are not accurate to your story? The second is transparency. So if you do decide to use generative AI, make sure that your film team knows that it's happening. And then make sure that your audience knows it's happening. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. The third part is about legal considerations. So this is a very evolving space, and we advise filmmakers, no matter what, if you're going to have generative AI, whether it be for ideation or music or animation, reenactment, whatever it is, you have to talk to legal counsel, because depending on what platform you're using, a lot of generative AI outputs are not even copyrightable in the US. And there are a lot of rules internationally around what can be broadcast, for example, on German public television versus what can be broadcast on an American-owned streamer. So it might seem quick and easy, but because everything is so undecided, it can cause problems down the line. And then the fourth is ethical considerations when using human simulations, which is basically the human voice, the human body, the human face. These are all things that are really sacred, and it's very easy, especially with voice simulation, to make someone say whatever you want them to say. And in the US, you can't actually defame a dead person. So you can get a historical figure to say most things quite easily for very little money, and likely not even be liable. But when you're doing that within a documentary, you really need to think about what you're doing to the historic record and making sure that your audience knows that you're simulating somebody, but that you don't actually have a recording or a video of them saying it themselves. And that's really all of the guidance. And I think that even as things evolve, it will be a useful sort of groundwork for people to make decisions about how they want to engage with these tools.
Well, I actually have like specific questions for each of the principles that you said.
Great.
Maybe, yeah, we can, I don't know, maybe we should just go through the list of questions before like diving in each of them.
I love that.
Some people, even though that AI now is in our lives, in WhatsApp, in ChatGPT, like in everything, basically Facebook. I don't know if people are aware of what is generative AI, or generative artificial intelligence. GAI, that's how you describe it, right? Could you explain us what it is?
Something that I think is important to consider in documentary is, are you using a tool that is making assumptions and creating content based on assumptions that machine has made? Or are you, for example, using AI to do a transcript, which could be considered assistive? That is also generative, because the way that we transcribe things does come with a lot of biases. But it's on a spectrum with, for example, just generating an image of Henry VIII eating a pie. Like that is something that is fully generated. So something that's really important that we've been talking with filmmakers about is generative AI is now built into the tools that we're using. So it's really easy to, when you go into Adobe Premiere or Photoshop, to use generative fill or generative extend, which means you have a photo and then you just have it fill in the sides for you.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're trying to make filmmakers aware of is you are making a totally new archival object. If you are using generative fill or generative extend in any way, a machine is dictating for you what will fill in the blanks of that rest of that image.
Now that you're talking about like some of the tools, could you like mention like which ones are the most like commonly used? I know that there exists, like Midjourney for images, Runaway for like video or film, 11 Labs for audio, and even like Suno, which is like one where you can create music.
I mean, you just mentioned a lot of the ones that I know about. I also know that Getty Images has a image generator that is trained on their stock content that they actually say is licensable safe, which means if you do generate something there, you could put it in your film. I would say that something coming from there might have an even smaller model, so there's a potential for more bias, but I haven't played with the tool enough to actually know that. So yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned a lot of them. And then I think the big one is Adobe and Adobe Firefly. That is the tool that everyone uses. And they are a big player in developing generative AI and also a big player in developing the Content Authenticity Initiative and the C2PA metadata standard, which is they're working with a lot of companies to try to add a level of verification or sort of a nutrition stamp to the metadata of images to show where or if they have been manipulated by generative AI. But I do think it's really important for people to know, especially editors. I know you yourself are an editor, is looking at when we want to, for example, do something what seems as benign as taking a vertical photo. And, it'd be really nice if it were a horizontal photo. But when you're taking a vertical photo to a horizontal photo, which with generative extend takes, 4 seconds, you really need to consider the impact that has on the meaning of that image, because you're just creating something totally new.
Of course, it could be like misrepresentative, basically of a historic event, a community, or a person, basically. I actually have a couple of anecdotes about that. The previous film that I was citing before, the name of the film is about Elaine Jones, who was one of the first African-American women to play in American orchestras in the United States. So in the 1930s, she grew up in Harlem, and she played in the New York Philharmonic Orchestra in the 50s. But basically, we had like a gap there that we didn't have like any images of her like growing up. So we started like giving prompts, to Midjourney and basically creating images from nowhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there were like a lot of ethical concerns there that we decided not to really, jump into. I think like we are still like more interested like in creating all of these aesthetics through animation that you can tell that it's like a interpretation in art. And then she also wrote a book, a memoir, like I said, and what we also started experimenting was to use her voice to read like some passages of the book that we also didn't have in the story, like these gaps. And it did an incredible job. I think like if you definitely not know that this is made by AI, it could pass as authentic.
One thing that's interesting, just in terms of a turn of phrase that you used, was that you'd be using her voice to narrate the film. And what does it mean to use someone else's voice? Because it's not actually her voice. It's a machine guessing based on an input what would go next. And it's also guessing based on whatever age she was, whatever mood she was in with the input, all of that. And so you're not actually using her voice. It's just to reframe it a little. It's a machine making educated guesses based on an input that comes off a lot like her voice, that is completely indistinguishable. And that, to me, it's a big one to wrap my head around. We're developing a concept that we're calling uncanny history. It's sort of like, like the book Uncanny and the phrase Uncanny Valley about what happens in Silicon Valley. But the idea of uncanny history is just that something seems real, that it's so close, but something is off about it. So it has the authority of something that was really recorded, someone sitting down and reading her memoir, that never actually happened in real life. That person never actually sat down and was like, I'm going to read my memoir for an audiobook today and that kind of thing. But it seems as if she did because of the manipulation of the filmmaker. So I find that to be very interesting and not necessarily a wrong thing to do, of course, especially with consent, especially when ethical considerations are in place for the use of that technology. I think by the time this episode airs, we will have published a toolkit. The toolkit includes 10 questions that filmmakers can ask themselves as they're considering diving in, that touch on all of the principles, cue sheets that they can use to track generated elements. It also includes advice for how to track it and who should track it. Just like with any new technology, it needs to be someone's job on a production to actually track what generative AI is in there, because it's really important for delivery to streamers and all sorts of things, to make sure that your film can even air.
I feel that that's going to be like an extra step now when making documentaries, like bringing all of the team that was part of the archival producing and also probably the editing, and just like confirming that all of the materials that are in the film are authentic.
Yeah. And to your question earlier, that can be really hard because nobody defines generative AI the same way. So we just advise, if you're going to use generative AI, just track it. Just make sure everybody knows what's real, what's not, and where it came from. Because that kind of thing, when you're trying to sell your film, is going to really make a difference. And also when you're trying to raise money for your film, it's going to really make a difference.
Yeah, like how can we, as audience, can we know that what they are showing us is real? I mean, this is like a controversy in a way, because I feel that, at least from my perspective, I feel that people usually think that documentaries are completely authentic and real, and they don't really think about like who's making the film in a way.
We definitely, as we were writing this guidelines, we decided not to even try to define documentary film, because what that means is so different. What we do talk about is nonfiction work bears witness to experience. And if you really keep that at the core of your practice and of the way that you think about making these decisions, I think that can sometimes help ground. So yeah, I mean, something that we worried about, and part of the reason we wrote the guidelines, is we want there to be public trust in documentary film. Documentary films will always have bias. Archives are, as I said before, very biased. But at least you can point to a perspective of a person or people that came to make that. With generative AI, it's not the same. It's an amalgamation. It's a blender that's not accountable to any one person. So that's just something to know, like a very basic thing about large language models.
So yeah, when we create like generative AI, we are not really the creators, right? Like you said, it's an amalgamation basically, but it's like the software or the AI, basically the one who is the creator. So when you kind of finish a film that has like generative AI, those assets, those materials don't belong to you because you're not the creator, right?
Right.
So who owns that?
There are people like trying to knock down the doors of the copyright office right now, trying to get an answer on that. It is very confusing, and we probably won't know for another three years where the courts fall on that. And also it's a spectrum. So what if, for example, you have generative AI write a script and then you edit it? So then it's 80% made by generative AI or 20%. Like, it's really complicated. And it also depends on which tool you're using. But check out the Copyright Office updated their standards on this in January and basically said, we won't know. But that human authors are currently the only ones that can claim copyright. And things that are generative AI output are not made by human authors. So thus cannot be copyrighted. That, however, is not true. In China, you can copyright that. So it also is different in every country in the world. And also it even varies by state in the US. So all of this is up in the air as these technologies emerge, and really depending on who's in power and what judges can even understand what this technology is and how we define what copyright and ownership even are.
I feel that also, like, all of these materials that AI is being fed on, the work history, and of course, like, until now, the work has been like a really misogynistic and also racist place. Mm-hmm. So basically, the AI is being fed with all of that knowledge. So it creates like a lot of misrepresentations or stereotypes.
Yeah. I think it's worth people going in to any image generator, just write in a doctor. Have it generate an image of a doctor. Do you know what's going to come out? White men with white coats, maybe with glasses, maybe without glasses, likely with a tie, likely salt and pepper, kind of silver fox. If you type in a cleaning person, just imagine what's going to come out. When we use these tools, we just need to be really sanguine about the fact that they're just guessing based on what they know. And what they know is likely racist and misogynistic and representative of colonial power. And so proceed with caution, which doesn't mean don't proceed. When I tell people I'm doing this work, they're often like, oh, are you pro or anti-AI? And I'm like, there's no point in being pro or anti. We passed that when computers were invented. But instead, we really need to just know what it does well, know what it does badly, and educate ourselves, even if we don't want to, because it's here to stay.
Just to wrap up, could you talk about the toolkit that the Archival Producers Alliance is working on?
Yeah. So we created a toolkit that I think will be online by the time this episode comes out. And it's the best practices for use of generative AI, but in a much more usable form. So the first thing that we will encourage filmmakers to do is we have 10 questions to ask when you're starting to use generative AI. Like, have you considered the bias within the tools? And do you have legal counsel that's aware of what's going on? Do you have a way to track generative AI materials? Another thing is we'll have crediting guidelines. So we encourage people to, in your end credits, to say, if you use generative AI, talk about what tool you used, or talk about what historian advised you to make sure it was verified. So we'll have guidelines for that. We have a cue sheet, which I think when some people hear that, they want to take a nap. But it's where we as archival producers live. So it's a suggested way of tracking materials. So much of what we do as archival producers is try to predict, like, you fell in love with this shot from the 1980 World Series. Well, that's going to cost you, upwards of $25,000. Why don't you replace it with a photograph? Things like that. That's what we do as archival producers. We try to anticipate needs based on budget, based on availability, based on quality. And the toolkit very much falls within that. So filmmakers can do that with generative AI themselves, just making sure that they're anticipating any possible problems and making sure they're communicating with their team about those problems early on. So nothing's a surprise, because there's enough that's surprising for us independent filmmakers. We don't need more of them.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie, for taking the time and sharing with all of us your knowledge. I think this is going to be super important. And also, we just need to keep up with everything that is updating every day. Yeah. So thanks so much for sharing all of your knowledge with the PC community.
Yeah, it's so great to see you. Shout out to the Big Sky Documentary Film Festival that brought us together. And come see us at archivalproducersalliance.com. Hope to meet you guys at some upcoming event.
So this episode of Rough Cut was hosted by me, Daniel Chavez, and produced by Audrey Horwitz, and executive produced by Sky Dylan Robbins and Kat Baker. Our original music is by Zach Wright.
Rough Cut is part of the Video Consortium, which is a global creative community and organization that supports the world's nonfiction filmmakers and video journalists to tell bold stories that catalyze change. We would love for you to join our nonfiction film family, and you can learn more at videoconsortium.org.
And we love hearing from listeners. So if you would like to send us a note, you can find us on Instagram at Rough Cut Podcast, or you can send us an email at podcast@videoconsortium.org. And don't forget to rate us and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and subscribe. Thank you, and see you soon.